You've felt it. You go to the grocery store, grab the same stuff you always grab, and somehow the total is $20 more than it was 2 years ago. Nobody warned you, nobody asked you, it just happened. And here's the thing, you've probably accepted it. We all have. We assume prices only go one direction, up. It feels like gravity, like a law of nature, like the sun rising. But it's not. That's what this video is actually about. Rising prices every single year, forever, is not some ancient economic truth. It's a modern invention, a policy choice. And once you understand how it works, you'll never look at your grocery receipt the same way again. Here's what we're covering. First, the psychological trick that makes prices permanent once they go up. Then, the weird math inside the official inflation number that most people have never heard of. And finally, the historical reality that blows the whole inflation is natural story wide open. Let's go. Okay, start with the thing that probably frustrates you most. Prices go up fast, but they never come back down. There's a name for this. Economists call it the ratchet effect. A ratchet is a mechanical tool that only turns one direction. It clicks forward and locks. You can't push it back. Prices work exactly the same way. Here's how it plays out. A company's costs go up. Maybe shipping got expensive. Maybe raw materials spiked. So they raise prices. Makes sense. But then shipping costs drop back down. The prices don't follow. Why? Because you adapted. You grumbled. Maybe you switched brands for a week, but eventually you paid the new price. And the moment you did that, the company ran an experiment on you, and you passed. They discovered the new ceiling of what you'll tolerate, and they're not giving that back. This isn't cynicism, this is just how markets work. The higher price becomes the new normal, the new floor, and the next increase starts from there. But here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. The ratchet effect isn't just about prices on shelves, it's baked into your paycheck, and your paycheck is actually the main reason prices can never fall. Think about this. Wages make up roughly 70% of what it costs a company to operate. Salaries, benefits, hourly pay. It's the biggest line item on almost every business's balance sheet. So, if wages never drop, prices basically can't drop either, and wages almost never drop, not because of some law, because of human psychology. When a company cuts someone's pay, that person doesn't just feel poorer, they feel disrespected, they slow down, they do the minimum, they start looking for another job. Managers figured out a long time ago that cutting wages costs more than it saves, so instead of cutting pay, companies lay people off. The people who stay keep their salary. Labor costs stay high. Prices stay high. Here's the part that'll stick with you. Say you're making $55,000 a year. Your company has a rough year. Inflation spikes, so they give everyone a bump to $60,000. Next year, things stabilize. You get your standard 3% raise. But that 3% is now calculated on $60,000. Not $55,000. So your raise in dollar terms is permanently larger, and the year after that, it compounds again from the new higher base. You didn't just get a raise, you installed a higher floor, and every future raise builds off that floor, forever. That's important. But if you stop there, you're missing something even stranger, something that lives inside the official inflation number itself. The government measures inflation using something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It's basically a shopping cart of common goods and services. Every month, the government checks the prices in that cart and tells you how much more expensive life got. Sounds straightforward, but there's a line item in that cart that will genuinely surprise you. It's called Owner's Equivalent Rent, OER for short. And it is one of the single largest components of the entire inflation calculation, somewhere around 25 to 30% of the CPI. It's massive. Here's the catch. It's a price that almost nobody actually pays. OER is an estimate of what homeowners could theoretically charge to rent their own house, if they decided to become landlords instead of living there. It's hypothetical. It's a number that lives on a spreadsheet. The majority of American homeowners are not renting out their homes. But the government plugs in an estimated rent anyway, and that number moves the inflation needle more than almost anything else in the basket. So, when the Fed says inflation is running at, say, 4%, a huge chunk of that number is based on a rent that exists only in a statistical model. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how they chose to measure it. But it means the number you see on the news is not quite the thing you think it is. And it gets stranger. Here's one most people have never heard. The CPI also applies something called an age bias factor to rental prices. Every 6 months, when the government checks the price of a rental unit, that unit is 6 months older than it was last time. So the math adjusts for the fact that you're technically getting a slightly worse product, an older apartment, for the same rent. Which means even if your landlord hasn't raised your rent at all, the inflation calculation treats your rent as if it effectively went up, because you're getting less for the same price. Your rent is frozen. The inflation math says otherwise. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what about shrinkflation? That's the one everyone talks about. The Doritos bag that used to have 16 ounces and now has 13. The yogurt container that got shorter. The toilet paper roll with fewer sheets. That's real inflation they're hiding, right? Here's the twist. The CPI actually does capture shrinkflation. It adjusts for package sizes. The problem is, the effect is almost nothing. The average annual impact of product downsizing on overall inflation is about 0.01%, 1/100th%. The thing you notice most at the grocery store barely registers in the official number. The gap between what you feel and what gets measured, that's the real story of inflation. Not a conspiracy, just a fundamental mismatch between human experience and statistical averages. Now, here's where I want to flip the whole conversation on its head. We've been talking about inflation like it's a permanent feature of human civilization, like it's always been this way. But here's a fact that genuinely stopped me cold when I found it. For most of American history, prices didn't only go up, they bounced. Before World War II, a period of high inflation was regularly followed by a period of deflation. Prices went up during a war or a boom, then came back down during the bust. The overall price level across a century stayed roughly stable. It wasn't a one-way escalator, it was a wave. The clearest example, the worst inflation in American history, wasn't the 1970s. It wasn't 2022, it was 1917. World War I drove prices up 17.8% in a single year. By June 1920, inflation hit 23.7%. That's higher than anything we've seen in living memory. But here's what happened next. It immediately reversed. 26 straight months of deflation. Prices dropped as low as negative 15.8% in a single year. The whole spike unwound. That violent swing, up then down, was normal. That was the pattern for over a century. The everything only goes up forever world is actually the weird one. It started roughly around 1940, and it didn't happen by accident. After World War II, governments and central banks around the world made a deliberate choice. They decided that deflation, falling prices, was more dangerous than inflation. The Great Depression had scarred an entire generation. Falling prices meant falling wages, meant unemployment, meant breadlines. So policymakers built systems designed to keep prices gently rising, always rising. A little inflation, the thinking went, is the price of stability. And for the most part, it worked. America has never experienced true hyperinflation. While countries like Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, and Brazil in the early 1990s watched their currencies collapse, the US kept course correcting. To understand what real hyperinflation feels like, think about Brazil in the early 1990s. Monthly inflation was running around 80%, not per year, per month. Shoppers would race to the supermarket at opening time, not because of a sale, but because store employees would spend the afternoon re-stickering every item with higher prices. If you waited until afternoon, you paid more. A dozen eggs that cost $1 on Monday could cost $1,000 a year later. People got paid twice a day and immediately spent their money before it lost value by evening. That is what the US has never had. And that's actually the remarkable part of the American story. Not that prices rise, but that they rise slowly and predictably enough that you can plan around them. The slow leak is the design. You feel it, you can't quite see it, but it's there on purpose. So let's pull this together. Prices never come back down because of the ratchet effect, the psychological moment when you accept a higher price and permanently reset the ceiling. Wages are the glue that locks it in, because no company can cut pay without paying a bigger cost in morale and productivity. And because wages keep compounding off higher and higher bases, the floor keeps rising automatically. The official inflation number you hear about is partly built on hypothetical rents that homeowners don't actually pay, and adjustments for aging apartments, while the thing you actually notice, shrinkflation, barely moves the needle statistically. And the whole prices always go up world, it's only about 80 years old. It's a policy choice, not a law of nature. If this reframed how you think about inflation, drop a comment below. Tell me what surprised you most. Was it the ratchet effect, the fake rent in the CPI, the fact that 1917 was worse than the 1970s? I genuinely want to know, and that conversation helps more people find this video. And if you want to go deeper, we did a whole video on why the housing market is broken in a completely different way than you think. It connects directly to everything we just talked about. That one's up next. Subscribe if you're new. Every video here is built to actually explain something, not just fill time. The slow leak is real. Now you can see it.